Hello everyone, welcome. We are today 16th of June, so this will be our last spring entity because we're into summer. And it feels like summer outside today, beautiful sunshine. We were lucky enough to be over at a friend's place who does an amazing job with food, and she really showed us her stuff. I think she had 50 different foods in one meal.
It was amazing.
That was really well done. I think next time she's shooting for 100.
Yeah.
And she'll probably achieve it. A brilliant cook, Renee. What's her organization called?
Renee Robbins Nutrition.
Okay, there you go. So anyway, welcome everyone. I'm of course Bill Code, and this is my colleague,
Hi.
Christina Metz. And Christina is a therapist at Taymount Canada. And part of the reason we were having lunch together today is we finally launched our website. So if you want to have a look at Taymount, Taymount, Canada.com. So it talks more about our website for that gut floral transplant stream of care. It's different. It has different pieces on it and different information and different contact entities, as opposed to, you know, for those of you who aren't into Facebook or have friends that they want to send this to, you know, you're welcome to now connect them online. What's the right term for connecting them on Facebook?
Just share. I don't know.
sharing and you know, putting things forward just for today's entity. And then of course, after today, they're always taken in that recorded video format, put onto the blog at Dr. Bill Code, DrBillCode.com. And of course, you can also now do it in audio, because I know some of you are on the go. I don't want you watching the video while you're driving. This isn't a good idea, but you can certainly go with that part. So I think we talked about today would be
gluten and dairy.
Gluten and dairy. So I know it's a hot, angry topic for some of you. I couldn't possibly be a problem on that, and I probably was in that group too. It's 28 years ago I moved out to Vancouver Island, and I didn't know that within 5 years I would be gluten-free, but there you go. Things happen. And certainly though the west coast of Canada, a bit like California in the US or Colorado in the US, it's kind of, I think of it as the left coast or the avant-garde changes. Changes are accepted more quickly here. You've got people with inquiring, investigative minds. Not that you don't have other places, but it's safer to change things here. People accept change more readily.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to cover the pros and cons as well, and then maybe talk about specific groups that might respond either negatively or positively, so to gluten and dairy.
Yeah.
We're going to be real about it.
Well, that's right, because it's still a major part of people's diet. There's just no question about it. And you need to look at why. The other thing I'd like to do, I mean, everybody's heard of celiac disease. I don't think we have an equivalent in dairy, not a term.
No.
In the same sort of format. And we know celiac disease was 1 in 400 30 years ago, and now it's at least 1%, so that's 4-time increase in 30 years. And it's, some people are saying it's even 2 and 3%. And then the other really important piece that we always forget is there's non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and this could be up to 1/3 of people. And that is almost always a neurologic issue. But we're pretty broad-minded with the neurologic issue. It can be mental health issues like depression or schizophrenia or bipolar, or it can be certainly other entities that you might have, even things like suicide risk. And we can give you some of the explanation because that's been worked out in the last year or two. Yeah. So I'm currently gluten and dairy free. I used to cheat on ice cream, and I do that even less and less and less because it makes a difference. How about yourself? Are you?
I'm gluten and dairy free, although occasionally I will cheat and have cream in my coffee.
Yeah. So everybody, I mean, life is a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
And no matter how, it depends on how severely sick you get, because if you're really severely sick, it's a bit like a nasty hangover.
Yeah.
You can remember what caused it a little longer if it's really rough. And the same as if you're really sick, then your memory's better. Or you'll learn that a little cheating. Now, a little cheating we often do, but it doesn't come without some risk, unfortunately, because our body, when it gets that little cheat, it absorbs and gets into the bloodstream, and all of a sudden, for 3 and 6 months, our antibody response to that gluten or to that dairy component, usually casein, the cheese protein, is a problem. And so that's why you're going to have more troubles. So I cheat less and less, and even when I'm out eating, because it's hard for restaurants. Sometimes there's a language barrier. I mean, Argentina, they would, bend over backwards to do it. Italy, if you say you're celiaca, I think that's the right word, why, they're all over it. And they've got gluten-free pastas and the whole deal.
Yeah, I had a great time in Portugal as well. There was not a problem there.
So you would say the word in Portuguese?
No, not even. I just, it was such a weird time there. I was using like a mix of Spanish, but they weren't, I don't know. Portuguese actually isn't anything like Spanish, so.
It's not very close. No, it's not very close. We were just briefly on the border at the Iguazu Falls, which is in between Brazil and Argentina, and Paraguay comes right down to the corner too, but very different languages. They're not that fluent to interact. They can sometimes cope to some degree, but it's not very major. So to talk about gluten dairy, and so I have to confess at the beginning that I'm a small farm prairie boy from Saskatchewan, or for the Midwest of Canada, the United States, and wheat is still the number one crop in a major way. Has been for a long time. So with that confession, I can go on to say, why many of you would think about shifting that. And I didn't learn it early on. I was lucky enough to see a young woman the other day. She's 14. She's had multiple fractures. The last one, she's quite a dancer, and she fractured her foot dancing, and it was very slow to heal. And eventually, in the whole workup, they discovered that she was osteoporosis.
At 14.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens in the very gluten sensitive, plus or minus celiac, but they often develop severe osteoporosis. So, we dedicated a whole chapter in the book to gluten sensitivity, and it becomes gluten and dairy, and we'll talk why in a minute. But, I was in that same group. I had my first fracture when I was 10. I had a couple more in high school, from minimal injuries. Well, 3 more in high school, and then multiple rib fractures since, and eventually collapse of lumbar L1 completely. So now I'm 2 inches shorter instead of 1 inch shorter, typically, and by the time we hit our 50s, because it's compression of the place between the spines, or between the vertebrae, okay, the discs tend to compress. But if you've lost 2, then that means one of them collapsed. So consequently, and I watched my mom, she had her diagnosis of osteoporosis in her early 50s, but probably lost 4 or even 6 inches of height during that time frame. So it can be pretty graphic. I use my family as a bit of an example. There was 7 of us. There was 4 boys. One of the fellows is 6'3.5", and one is 6'5.5", and I made it to 6 feet, and my other brother, who since passed away from HIV or AIDS, was 5'11", so almost the same. So we were relatively shorter, 4 to 6 inches. We have 3 sisters. One of them was 5'2.5", one of them was 5'9", and one of them was 5'10". Consequently, that same sister, at the age of roughly 40, was told she had the bones of an 80-year-old. So osteoporosis and lack of height gain is one of the true markers for gluten sensitivity. But it's not very well known / accepted, even though the literature supports it, in the regular population. Because this young woman had seen a dietitian to have better food optimization and all these sorts of pieces, but no one was talking about being off gluten and dairy completely, despite the mom knowing that she was gluten and dairy sensitive. And of course, this thing is a bit genetic. There's a genetic component. There's 2 genes seen in humans that encompasses probably 90% of people gluten and dairy sensitive, okay? but we don't test for those genes typically.
Mm-hmm.
And just because you have the gene doesn't mean it will necessarily express itself. But some things really aggravate it. And we'll get into some of that today, because you might be going along life pretty good, and then in your 50s and 60s, which is the typical time that celiac's diagnosed, in your 5th and 6th decade, either you're on a different food or you're on a different set of, toxins that you take in. And a big one I think that's bumped things up is glyphosate, because it messes up the body's microbiome by being an antibiotic. And that aggravates the whole gut lining and aggravates any of the inflammation that gluten will trigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what got you on the path to starting to change?
The Hashimoto's diagnosis.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hashimoto's thyroiditis, of course, which is hypothyroidism. And, I think gluten is one of the big triggers for that.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense because gluten irritates the gut lining hugely and creates leaky gut. So if you have the gut cells held together, and they're held together by kind of a cement or a tight junction formation, when the swelling and inflammation occurs due to the gluten, all of a sudden there's bigger gaps and bigger holes. You've got leaky gut. The protein, in this case gluten, gets into the bloodstream. The body does the correct thing. It recognizes it's a foreign protein. It creates an antibody against it. And in Hashimoto's, that protein that it's forming for against gluten, or the gluten component, now looks like the thyroid. So now you've got a set of antibodies from the cells in the body working against the thyroid gland. And so now you've got reduced thyroid production. And that, I would suggest, is the basis of 400 some so-called autoimmune diseases now. We've got so many. The name doesn't matter all that much, because the treatment should almost be the same. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I didn't test positive for celiac, but I was having such crazy mood swings in the beginning. And I noticed right away, as soon as I removed the big 5: gluten, dairy, corn, soy, and eggs, that made a really big difference right off the bat.
Those are really high on the list of food sensitivities.
Yeah.
There was no question about it. And you mentioned the mood swings, and so that's where, we'll start to talk about it now, because in the last year or two, we've learned a lot about an enzyme which is in the gut lining. It's called DPP4, Roman numeral 4, and it stands for dipeptidyl peptidase 4, okay? So when it's present and working well, it can do a better job of breaking down gluten and dairy. It's not foolproof, but it's much better. In 1/3 of the population, it's a decreased amount, all right? So I'm probably in that group, gluten sensitivity. I haven't had a formal diagnosis of celiac, so your diagnosis of celiac, did it go as far as a biopsy?
Yeah, that's how they did it for me.
But they didn't find a positive?
No.
I mean, the sad part is, certainly in Canada, maybe it's better in parts of the United States, or other parts of the world, but here you'll be 6 months waiting to see your gastroenterologist, and they'll book, an endoscopy or a scope from above. They'll take biopsies of the gut, and they'll look at them under a microscope, and especially if you've got a very well-skilled, experienced pathologist, if they take the right bite of tissue and they look at it appropriately and they find the right screens, they can say, yep, you've got celiac. In Europe, they don't do any of that. And I don't think there's any reason to do any more of it here either. The only advantage in Canada of having a formal celiac diagnosis confirmed by your gastroenterologist is that now you can deduct the extra cost of your food from the normal cost of food from your taxes. But that's a small reason, because meanwhile, you have to eat all that gluten leading up to the test.
Yeah.
Or the body tends to heal up. In fact, if you leave it long enough to be diagnosed in your 50s and 60s, and they will only give you a celiac diagnosis if you've got stage 3 or stage 4, meaning you've got a super flat brush border. Likely, ordinarily you would like to have all these villi and then villi on the villi called microvilli. But if that's all flattened, you can imagine your absorptive capacity and surface area is much less. So I'm partly in that group. That's partly why I can eat so much with relative impunity, because I've got a degree of malabsorption. Full stop. And many people do. So that enzyme helps that to some degree, but about a third of the population have a reduced amount of that enzyme, DPP4. And it's almost a year now. I was at a conference hosted by Great Plains in Vancouver, Great Plains Labs, and now they are a year being able to test in the serum of people, do they have a relative shortage of that enzyme? And certain things really mess up that enzyme, okay? So then these people start to think, well, gee, I can handle gluten and dairy before, now I can't, I don't feel as good. So it's interesting, one of them is in the 2 or 3 new drugs that now we have for treating type 2 diabetes, because it happens to suppress that same enzyme. The other thing that suppresses that enzyme is a lot of herbicides and pesticides, not glyphosate per se, but the organophosphates, and many of these agents that are in things can build up over time and also depress that enzyme. And so these are the people, if they have depression, schizophrenia, autism symptoms, ADHD, even early Alzheimer's. If they go off gluten and dairy, they're quite a lot better, okay? Because that enzyme is working to do a better job in the digestive process to make a difference. Because we've known for 20, 30 years, I think, about the 2 components. Because when gluten gets into the bloodstream, or a breakdown product of it, probably gliadin or some variation thereof, and the same happens with a breakdown product of casein, which is cow's milk primarily, all of a sudden we have created in the body a morphine-like substance which works on the brain.
Yep.
And that gives you the fuzzy thinking, gives you the mood swings, it can give you depression, it can make you even suicidal, it may give you bipolar entities, and it certainly can give you psychosis or schizophrenia-like symptoms.
And then the addictive behavior comes in as well. So, I mean, for us working with the autism clients, we're supposed to look out for the foods that they really want all the time, because those addictive behaviors can be cues as to what they're sensitive to.
Because think about the addictive behaviors, and so that's why the short story, you take somebody off when they love gluten. I mean, there's a big clue. If they really love something, it's a relative addiction, and the reason we know now is the addiction, it creates that morphine-like substance which acts on the brain, on the opiate receptor. You take that food away, you take that away, and they go through a relative withdrawal. So no wonder they're irritable and dislike it. You want to add a piece about that?
I also found it really interesting how in the autism conference, the Autism 1 conference, they were talking about these opioids and how the opioids end up blocking the uptake of cysteine, and cysteine is something you emphasize as being really, really important for glutathione and for detoxification. And so not only are you having to deal with these symptoms related to the opioids, but you're also having reduced detoxification.
Well, that's right, because if you block the cysteine is the amino acid that's a rate limiting step for you building the 3 amino acid compound called glutathione, which is our #1 detoxifier. It's our #1 built inside the body antioxidant. So as soon as you take someone who's very sensitive to all these changes and take away one of their ways to deal with it by tying up all the glutathione or making less of it, you're going to aggravate the symptoms. And so it's really quite a check and balances all across the line as to how it makes a difference. And so it's no benefit to have that ongoing opiate type component acting on the brain. It's almost like an opiate overdose, and that's why it can give clouded thinking, problems with the ADHD, and yet we can control it a lot with food.
Would it be worth testing with like a skin prick test?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So it's a good question though, because many people think, well, if I'm food sensitive, can I test it with a skin test? I saw an allergen specialist years ago. That's what people will tell you. And they did skin tests, and I'm allergic to, well, grasses perhaps, or pollens, but I'm not allergic. But we don't eat through the skin. So putting a foreign protein, whether it's gluten or dairy or whatever it is, under the skin and seeing if it reacts or not is almost no value, because almost all of our food sensitivities happen, of course, from the lips on down, but primarily in the gut, all right? And that's where the immune system response, 70 or even up to 80% of it occurs, is right at that same gut lining.
And then what about the food sensitivity panels?
I think the food sensitivity panels of IgG can be exceedingly useful, okay? And yet that's not very accepted in ordinary regular medicine as yet. The naturopaths are on board, the functional medicine doctors are on board, some of the integrative medicine doctors are on board, and I think I can find the odd gastroenterologist who's on board, but they're few and far between because it isn't in the regular purview. Our idea of sensitivity is full on allergenics, okay? And so, I spent lots of time worrying about allergic responses to different drugs, because if you're giving an anesthetic and you get a new reaction, your blood pressure may disappear, and you have all these times trying to get the patient back, so you don't want to go into that. Acute allergic response is different than a food sensitivity. To me, and we'll get to your description in a sec, because food sensitivity to me means a relative intolerance to that food. It probably isn't lethal, probably doesn't take your breath away, probably doesn't give you a skin rash, although it might, but it could give you abdominal cramping, feeling unwell, clouded thinking, and all these pieces. In reality, it's more of a food sensitivity, meaning you do better without it. Sometimes we get, I think nearly half of people, we get a histamine response.
So I was taught to differentiate between sensitivity and intolerance.
Yeah.
And the intolerances actually encompass oxalates, salicylates, histamines, lactose, these things that have like specific almost pathways involved or enzymes.
Yeah, they
involved.
do. Pathways or enzymes involved.
Yeah.
Okay, fair
and
enough.
then the sensitivities can be more random. Like you can be sensitive to something like carrots, just out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I have a friend that she can't have carrots. If she gets it on her lips, apples. So, it's pretty graphic because they get swollen lips and sometimes even swollen throat and stuff, but usually they figure it out really quickly because they learn it over time. No, it's useful to have the differentiation in the two, for sure. And the intolerances aren't as easy to test for in the IgG food sensitivity testing.
Yeah, exactly. I definitely am a fan of the like the food journal and just removing the foods for a while and then trying to reintroduce them. Although it is a bit more challenging for some people. It's like you say, with men, if you can use the food sensitivity panels and
It's
look
really
out for
hard.
certain patterns, then...
Men live in denial. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I did for a long time too. And yeah, I'm a little more open to it than many men. I don't think I'm as intuitive as I would like to be, the way my spouse and many women are, and probably you are, but at least you can get partway. Because you eventually come to grips, you will do almost anything to try and make yourself feel better. And that's why, I don't recommend people to go on for that full-blown celiac testing and biopsy. I take much more of a European approach, which is, if you think you're sensitive to it, let's stop it for 3 months. And then if you want to retry it, good on you. You can give it a try. But if you feel like dreadful, then usually you'll wake up and, go that route. But it takes a while, and at least 3 months is a good guideline. Sometimes you'll even need to go 6. But also, don't just look at yourself, ask the people around you. Are you less irritable? Are you less grumpy? Are you less angry? Or do you seem to be able to focus better? Because the people around you will notice the changes sometimes even before you do. One advantage of a chronic illness, you get to know yourself pretty well, at least you should, because you need to have the nuances of what will work, what won't work, and so on, but you can take it on from there. So I suggest a 3 months off, and then if you want to try reintroduce it, fine. I'm not going to be enthusiastic, it's going to help. And I think a couple of stories might help people. I mean, I like to talk about the study that was done in New England a few years ago. They did this on healthy young people. So that's in their 20s and 30s. Everywhere I go, there's more young people. How does that work, Christina? Anyway, so they did an endoscopy on all of these healthy, normal people, and they all had a normal, healthy-looking small intestine. And then they gave them a gluten meal, and then a few hours later, they did another endoscopy. And not just one or two, but 100% of people had inflammation in the gut after gluten. So how did gluten get designed to be that way? Well, there's a few things that made a nuance in it that it's much more graphic than it ever was. Number one was probably 30 years ago, we decided that the very best special wheat had the highest protein in it. And that was usually grown in northern Saskatchewan or northern Alberta, because when you've got a short growing season, the plant's very clever. It has more protein to get a jump start at the start of the season and get its growing done in that 90 to 110 days. Okay? So it can do it much better if it has high protein. The downside of higher protein in wheat, you had even more gluten molecules as it was eaten. Because Denise and I think in 2008 went for a Sicilian bike tour over in Sicily off the coast of Italy, which was fabulous. And we could almost eat at that time wheat with impunity. We could have pizza, we could have some breads. I didn't quite get into croissants, but it was tempting to. I love croissants. So anyway, it was very revealing, and we've come to understand since. It's been also aggravated in the last 30, 40 years because now we have a lot of glyphosate, and glyphosate is the Roundup component which irritates the gut lining and probably makes it even more sensitive to the problems of gluten reaction, because it also messes up the microbiome because it's a backup antibiotic. So those are 2 or 3 of the reasons that we're seeing it much more today than we were. And then this other enzyme that I've talked about, DPP4, Roman numeral 4, is also an aggravating factor. So if you get put on a medication which changes that, such as the new anti-diabetic drugs for type 2, not the old news metformin and stuff, but some of the very new age ones, they interfere with that enzyme. And then the other thing I talked about was, certain other agents, such as
well, you mentioned pesticides.
Yeah, pesticides and herbicides, yeah. Especially the ones non-Roundup. I mean, Roundup is the number 1 on the planet right now, unfortunately. But number 2, 3, and 4 usually poison that same enzyme.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that enzyme change has really been very huge for us. And so the other thing that will impact that is heavy metals. Include that within your heavy metals, include aluminum, but certainly mercury. I mean, that was part of my issue, of course, because I had all those mercury amalgams, which happily are gone now. But each of those are contributing factors to depress the activity of that enzyme. So if you've got relatively small amounts of the enzyme in the first place, and you get some other secondary effect on it, and now you've got a bigger problem.
Right.
And the newest thing on the block to try and minimize is that an enzyme isn't working adequately and you're having a problem, you're also going to have more risk of Alzheimer's, early onset memory loss. So that's what keeps me going, because I know I'm double the risk because I've got MS, so I'm double the risk of dementia, and I exercise and do all these other pieces. Maybe fear is driving me, I guess. But just the awareness and the knowledge that you need to take extra lengths if you want to grow to be an elderly person and still remember who you are, because that's my goal.
Yeah. Well, should we answer some questions?
Sure, we have some. Let's go.
Yeah. Hey Bill, are mushrooms problematic to the gut? I'm allergic to baker's and brewer's yeast and just had a negative response to mushrooms. Thank you.
Okay. Well, a good question, Sandra. Happily, you know, responding to the yeast is probably the excess of the specific type in the fungi group, which is Candida, okay, which I'm sure you realize and recognize. And, you know, I know you a little bit, so you have some food sensitivities, which you've even tried to help by having, you know, gut floral transplant. It's now, I think, 3 years ago that you went over to the UK for that. So mushrooms may be an issue, certain mushrooms, and so that's why you need to find out which group. And the other thing I would suggest with mushrooms, they should be cooked, okay? We often forget that. I remember being in Edinburgh one time. I went to an organic vegetarian restaurant in Edinburgh, and I had a big plate of mushrooms, and wow, I didn't feel very good after. But they were mostly raw. Unfortunately, there's a component in mushrooms most of us can't digest, and some of them are even carcinogenic. So cook your mushrooms, saute them, fabulous. There's no such thing as too much butter on mushrooms in my experience. That's the one thing I will cheat on the dairy world is grass-fed butter, and usually I get away with it, fortunately.
Yeah. You could also do ghee, but I would wonder, I mean, if you are reacting to the mushrooms because of yeast or candida overgrowth, there are some mushrooms that are actually antifungal. Reishi is an example of that. So I'm not sure.
You mean lesser amounts of the fungi in them?
No, reishi is actually antifungal against candida.
Oh, okay, it's but it is one itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's kind of an interesting concept.
It is interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a huge kingdom, and I'm sure they've worked out a lot of good responses, plus or minus. So, fair enough.
Rebuilding the microbiome should reduce IgG issues, should it not?
So that's from Bruce. A really good question, because, I mean, that's why I went over, you know, to the UK just over 3 years ago now. Prior to going, I had 7-8 features on my IgG food sensitivity testing, foods that I could not handle well. One was egg white, one was cashews, and, you know, several others. And when I did one a year later, and I was still off gluten and dairy, because of course that would have cropped up, I had almost a flat line across the board. I still had the issues on candida, and so baker's yeast and brewer's yeast and so on, but it is dramatic if you can get the microbiome healthy. So that's why we really lean on that. I said at the outset, you know, where we had a 50 different food meal at lunch today. So it can be done, but we're only asking you to do it once a week, 50 foods. So that gives you more scope. You get all those extra meals in there, up to 14, 21 meals, depending how many you're doing a day. And you can inculcate that into it and include spices in that mix. Each time we have a different, especially vegetable and fruit, it has a different fiber in it, supports a different team of bacteria within the gut, and every time we increase the diversity in the gut of a lot of different variety of things, the pathogenic issues within the gut all get diminished, and the growth of extra candida gets diminished, and our ability to, you know, if we've got optimal microbiome, converting the storage form of thyroid T4 to the active form in the body T3, a third of that happens in the gut microbiome. And at the same time, the liver functions better and the whole cascade of things work better.
And I've loved hearing about your test results. So how you ran the IgG testing for yourself in the beginning of your journey, and you've continued to do it over time. We've seen that the more your inflammation comes down, the more your gut heals, the less of these food sensitivities you have. Yeah.
And so I'm ready to go back into it again, because it's a journey, right? I mean, right now I'm a little messed up because I've got a bladder stone, so I get recurrent bladder infections, recurrent low-grade or treatments of antibiotics, including some of the ones I don't like at all, but, you know, fever and chills and racking being unwell doesn't go good either. But once I have that surgery and move on, then I'll go back to rebuilding the microbiome. I'll probably do another go-around of gut floral transplant, and, you know, I can stay back. I'll know all those foods, but I know I'm hitting it all the time with the antibiotics. Yeah. Same as some people are doing because they keep eating Roundup foods.
Right.
Got to get over those.
Okay, so Penny is asking, I had swollen lips when I first came to Canada and ate apples here. If I eat organic, I don't get this. I thought it was something that was put on the apples. Maybe it was wax?
Yeah. Well, it's possible it's the wax because they sometimes will put it on, but more likely because apples are sprayed a great deal. You know, if you grow them a lot of time. And often we're reacting to one of those sprays. And they say, well, no, I washed my apple. I'm sorry, it doesn't cut it because the sprays are put on the whole time the apple's growing. So it's got components of those sprays all the way through the apple. So you've done a very smart thing. You found that if you eat organic ones, you're okay. So that's a further indication it's almost for sure one of the contaminants within the system. And Sandra's asked you spell that particular mushroom. Reishi?
Oh, yep. R-E-I-S-H-I.
Yeah. There you go.
Does gluten have any relation to menopause symptoms?
Well, you're asking the wrong guy, of course, because I don't have menopause symptoms. But
I have a bit of an answer. So, I mean, if you have really strong menopause symptoms, that's a sign that your total body burden or your bucket is overflowing. So when you enter into menopause, all of a sudden you don't have as many hormones being made from your ovaries. So then other parts of your body have to take over, say your adrenals, for example. So your body's under more stress, and so your threshold is lower. So how can you increase your threshold or create more space in your bucket? Well, if you are sensitive to gluten, then you're going to create more space in your bucket by removing gluten.
And, you know, this bucket that she talks about, because, you know, lots of people say, well, I felt pretty good, and then I got a food poisoning. And I've never been the same since, even though they treated their food poisoning. Well, the food poisoning was, I guess, the straw that broke the camel's back. But over time, because maybe you'd taken in gluten and you were sensitive to it, and you were still doing dairy, and you were still eating ordinary foods and no regard for organic or not, and you were living in a place with really crap water, and all of a sudden, all these things build up in the body. You bring in a new stress, and menopause would fit as a new stress, just like pregnancy is a huge stress. Mm-hmm. Okay, you bring in a new stress, and all of a sudden, you've got to fix almost all of those items, at least some degree, before you can be enough well or get room in the bucket of wellness. Mm-hmm. Do you call it is it a bucket of wellness?
Yeah, it's the bucket or the rain barrel.
Yeah. Well, if you're really big on these items and you do a lot of things, sure, do a rain barrel. That's a good idea. Okay.
I think we're at the end of the questions.
All right. So why don't we talk a little bit about some of the other features, and while you're checking that out. So I've learned in the last few years about A2 milk. So even as call it a kid, when I was in family practice, people talked about this newborn, they could handle goat's milk, but they couldn't handle ordinary cow's milk. And you sometimes see that. Goat's milk is a slightly different protein at the front of the milk. And the tie-in, and this is why 80% of people that are gluten sensitive or dairy sensitive are the other, meaning that if you're gluten sensitive, you have an 80% chance of being dairy sensitive, because both of those have very similar amino acids on the end of the protein, and the body sees them initially as the same. And that's where the response happens. That's where that enzyme works, DPP4, and that's why it acts very similar on both. Some people, not all people, but some people will benefit by taking something that has a different protein on the end, i.e. goat's milk, sheep's milk, and now A2 milk. So A2 milk was initially, I think, discovered by a scientist in New Zealand. They started to look at it, and it became a marketing piece. And many of you know the types of cows or the breeds of cows that have more A2 milk. It's almost completely A2 milk from Jersey cows, Guernsey cows, those two little islands south of England, of course, but also a proportion now of Holsteins. Okay, so I've got a cousin, and they're a dairy farmers just north of Winnipeg, and the young fellow, you know, he's in his early 40s, and his parents are a little bit older, and consequence they're supporting this, but he's breeding his herd more and more to A2. Because almost everywhere in the US you can buy A2 milk. I mean, I've learned from you folks here, it is available in Calgary. I'm betting it's in Vancouver if you know the right place to look.
Yeah.
Maybe even in Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the Thrifties here, so.
Yeah, okay. So that's
great.
one of our major grocery stores for those
Yeah.
who don't know, even though Sobe bought them. So the A2 milk will be tolerated by more people more often. So I would suggest if you really have to have that little bit of your dairy once in a while in your milk, use A2. A2 cream, or if you really, really need to and you can't get by on coconut ice cream, get the real deal, but get it from Jersey cows, Guernsey cows. They typically were higher in butter fat anyway, so it was popular in that milieu.
And then if you're in the US, you could always try camel's milk, which we've had some pretty good feedback from some of our clients about camel's milk.
Have you ever tasted it?
I have tasted it. Yeah, it tastes quite good, actually.
It's a matter. I'm sure it's a matter of taste. It didn't do much for me.
Oh,
But-
maybe it was the batch.
Well, I'm sure it was. Yeah. And what did the camel eat? I get it. I mean, I grew up on a farm and we had 20 dairy cows, which we'd milk twice a day. Luckily, thank God, there was a machine by the time I got to 8 or 9 years old. But the dairy cows, when they were eating, you know, stinkweed and certain grasses out there, it tasted in the milk big time. Didn't do anything for me.
Okay. Well, maybe this is a good launching point kind of into the pros versus cons situation, because I mean, there are pros to consuming some of these things depending on how you do it. And just another example of something that's quite beneficial that comes from dairy is colostrum. So colostrum is shown in a lot of studies to be helpful for healing intestinal permeability. It's helpful for preventing and reversing damage caused by taking NSAIDs, so like aspirin or Tylenol, that type of thing, which actually physically damages the lining of the intestines. And then I have a friend, just as a story of a friend going through chemo right now, and she's found that colostrum is quite helpful for keeping her energy up.
Colostrum is interesting. It's a little more dramatic in cow's milk than it is in humans' breast milk, although, you know, there's a relative human breast milk colostrum as well, and that's why it's really important. And breast milk, breastfeeding in humans is hugely important, but, you know, I'm of that, I think I'm a Pacific as opposed to an Alphic. So this was powdered milk or condensed milk, which was diluted and fed to kids in formula. So, I mean, I'm 5th of 7, and so I get it. I know that's why I had it, but it had that relative downside to it. So I think if we can look at in the newborn calves, the newborn human or calves, almost all young, don't really have any great barrier developed in their gut lining yet because they haven't been using it yet. They've been living off the blood that comes through the placenta, through the circulation. Nutrition is there. So it has to develop over a few days and get that relative barrier where it lets the right things in and the not so right things don't get in. And colostrum in cow's milk, and I've used it too, and it can be dramatic in reducing sort of your leaky gut syndrome. So it's a purview. I've got some on hand for when I can quit doing antibiotics and so on. I mean, I used to do an ocean of ibuprofen and naproxen for my headaches. And even though it's sort of in that group, Tylenol isn't quite as injurious to that part. It's really nasty on what it does to the liver and your glutathione stores. But the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are really dynamite for worsening leaky gut syndrome. So it's really important. And so if one is on the journey to try and heal up that gut lining, so you're doing all the different foods, maybe you're doing a lot of probiotics, you're not sure you can afford or want to go for gut floral transplant, then a go of colostrum for 2 to 4 weeks, I think somewhere in that range, can often help you through that healing stage. So even though you're off dairy, you know, this tends to be okay. It's a different grouping of molecules in that first day or two of colostrum formation by the cows. So it's something to reach for.
You can also get liposomal colostrum. There is a certain brand called Sovereign Labs that makes liposomal colostrum, and it's quite easy to tolerate. The only maybe caveat I would mention is that if you've done the microbiome testing and you've seen that you have an overgrowth of sulfur feeding microbes or cysteine feeding microbes, you're not going to want to do colostrum or any dairy products.
Because it's going to mess it up or aggravate it.
You're going to feed those microbes.
Yeah.
You've got to reduce them first.
Yeah, so it's a trade-off, and I think the best way to change those microbes, hopefully, is shifting your diet. So it can happen gradually over time, and relatively less expensive for you too, and very safe, okay?
Yeah.
But you may need help in the counseling of that. So you may benefit from contacting the folks at Tame Out Canada, talking to Christina as a therapist or her colleague Cindy, because they've got a lot of extra training in that, in how to handle those diets. In fact, we went the extra mile. You did a lot of the training. Trudy? No. Anyway, I'm forgetting the name, but we've had some great courses that we've either done online or sometimes in person on SIBO. And there's a lot that you can do, but sometimes you need a bit of extra help with wisdom from the outside, and it's tricky to get it. It's not information you're going to get from your registered dietitian. And I know that pretty well because Denise was one for nearly 40 years, even though she's retired now as a master's in nutrition and nutrition consultant. And your physicians won't have the information, your nurses won't have the information, and very few people will. And you may not get the time that you need from your respective functional medicine doc. Sometimes they'll have the time and the knowledge, but not always. So then you want to find someone. So I think it's $100 Canadian, so pretty good value. Gets you 3/4 of an hour or whatever with someone like Christina. And if you need to investigate more, I mean, that's one route. Some people need the objective evidence. I'm thinking guys here, right? And some people, I mean, often they can figure out a great deal by a careful story, history, set of symptoms. It's not a diagnostic thing, but it's to give you alterations in your diet or food protocols, different names, things like FODMAPs and sulfur containing, to get the right mix for you. And if it isn't the right mix overall, then maybe you're going to also benefit from gut floral transplant. But every time you do more of the mix to get it correct, same as, correcting the bucket, so to speak, you're going to have a much better outcome and better quality of life for you, your gut, and your brain. The gut and the brain, the gut is sometimes called the second brain.
Yeah, Bruce is just asking what microbes are those, where there's about 20 or 25 different microbes that produce hydrogen sulfide, but the top 3 are Desulfovibrio, Bilophila, and actually E. coli.
So E. coli, I know.
Yep.
You could say the other 2 slower for me, please.
Oh, Desulfovibrio and Bilophila, so like bile-loving.
Yeah,
Yep.
they sound Italian. Maybe not Italian, but anyway. Okay, fair enough.
Okay, so do we want to talk about some of the other pros? So say you were to eat fermented dairy. That could actually be quite beneficial for you.
You might tolerate it much better than the ordinary dairy, and that's why, aged cheese or yogurt may be tolerated because they're semi-digested. The same as if you're on your road early continuum for having gluten sensitivity, you may get away okay with sourdough bread because it's pre-digested by the bacteria that are in it and the relative enzymes from it. I always like to give the story. So I heard this first from Tom O'Brien. So he held the first gluten summit, which is the very first of online summits and talks. So he was groundbreaking in that. I think it was 2013. Okay, so I just heard him on the other summit the other day. And he talked about, think of the gluten molecule as like a pearl necklace. Okay, so say it's got 100 pearls on it. So in a perfect world, each of those pearls would represent an amino acid. So if your gut was doing a great job, it would break all of those pearls down to separate, or maybe 1 or 2 in a group. But the regular enzymes in a human are able to take that 100 pearl necklace and chop it in 6 to 12 places. Each of these proteins, which are multipeptides, several amino acids, are potential risk factors for you having food sensitivity, leaky gut, and the whole scenario. So that's one reason that we weren't really made to handle gluten real well, although, yeah, it's saved a lot of starvation. It was the cause of the Roman Empire because you could carry the grain long distances, grow it in a new place. But it's also why some places never got very gluten tolerant, because in that group, the ones that were severe celiac disease had infertility problems, miscarriage problems, and so many of that group died out. Whereas if you're of Irish or Scottish origin, or Scandinavian, I can't put my hand up, anyway, that group was never conquered much by the Romans, so they didn't see wheat near as much. They had much more in oats and barley, which is less, it does have gluten in it, but it's less irritating to many than the gluten molecule. So consequently, those people are really noticing huge problems with celiac or gluten sensitivity in a neurologic fashion. And I know it's one of the triggering fashions for my headache, gluten sensitivity, but it's also a very irritating component in many of us for our gut, even with MS. And at least roughly 10% of MS is gluten sensitivity completely. So if you're with a diagnosis of MS, you've got to pack it in. I would suggest 3 to 6 months. If your MS is awesome, you go back on it, well, good on you, but I don't count it very likely.
Right. So the fermentation process does help to break things down, and there can be additional benefits from that. So say you were to have a like a 24-hour made yogurt or a 24-hour fermented kefir. Those are going to be really probiotic rich, and there are actually studies that show that they can improve things like intestinal permeability. They can improve your production of certain neurotransmitters such as GABA. So that's one of your transmitters that helps you feel calmer and more at peace.
Yeah.
And it can even improve markers associated with cardiovascular disease and diabetes.
Yeah. So it's getting that mix right. So probiotics originated around the turn of the 1900s. There was I think a Russian scientist. He went to Croatia, Romania area, and he recognized these people were living into their 90s. Some of them were making it 100. And he found the commonality among them. They were eating fermented foods, primarily, I think at that time, yogurt.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever you're fermenting, and you know, I've got Cindy intrigued with the idea of making kimchi from rhubarb.
Oh, amazing.
Or some other variation, because most societies have a fermented entity in them. I think of the Germans with their sauerkraut, and I think of the kimchi and the Koreans, and there was fermented mare's milk in the Mongolians.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't tried that yet. I'm not sure I'm going to. And then other fermented foods that we need to do more of.
Yeah, it's important to pay attention to the quality though. So there are also studies that show you get different benefits according to, like, say what type of kefir you're eating. So commercially made kefir comes with very little benefits versus something like a homemade kefir, or like I mentioned, a 24-hour ferment that's going to have more benefits. There are also different types of grains, so the different grains actually produce different benefits as well. So you can experiment, or you can go deep and look to the research.
Yeah. And so we plan to put those on increasingly. We've already put a few recipes on my blog website at drbillcode.com, and we'll be putting those on as we develop them. The same place you can go there for the toothpaste formula and all these other issues, because you need to do that work, do that journey, because it's going to make a difference to your well-being. And so now maybe it's worth just taking a minute. Well, why wouldn't I just swallow some probiotics?
Oh no, we're having trouble
Troubling with this video, so we'll see if it comes back. We're almost up to the hour.
Internet's fine.
Is it? Okay.
I wonder if we should just keep going, because it says we're still live, so maybe it's just having trouble going. Guys, can you comment if...
Can you comment in the chat
if
screen
we're still here?
if we're still visible? Sandra or Bruce, if you don't mind. Maybe we're invisible.
Yeah.
I've worked on being invisible all my life, and I finally achieved it. Okay.
Oh. Oh, Chris is still here.
Okay. So can you?
Oh, okay, good.
Okay.
You can see us.
Thank you,
That's
Chris.
okay.
So we don't need to look at ourselves on the screen. It must still be working. That's great. So I wanted to explain the difference between probiotics and using fermented foods. So probiotics, to make them a reasonable price, you take really healthy bacteria, usually from a healthy person, and you put it in a big vat, and you give it all kinds of nutrition, and it goes through a new generation every few seconds or minutes. And so you, at the end of the day or 2 weeks, you've got a huge number of bacteria containing, which are probiotic, they're friendly, healthy bacteria, and then you put them in capsules and give them to people. But the downside is they've gone through so many generations in the preparation that they've lost most of their wildness. So they're unable to team up with the bacteria within the gut or the gut that are right at the lining of the gut. And so within 10, 14 days of taking those probiotics, if you stop, they're all gone. Whereas if you're, doing fermentation at home for lactobacillus or sometimes for bifidus, these are brand new 1 or 2 generations or 3 generations, and all of a sudden they're going to work much better within you. Not only that, they may provide the prebiotic element, partially digested components within the food, which supports some of the teams of bacteria within the gut. Better to support your own personal teams you've got already and make them in better shape than it is to try to bring in a whole new set.
Mm-hmm. And then we do have some clients who comment that they really miss bread, and so for them I suggest when they get to the point where they're feeling stronger in regards to their food tolerances, they can try something like a 24-hour fermented sourdough bread, which again, it's going to break things down and make it easier to digest.
I'm not going there, Chief.
You're not going there?
No. I mean, it's a pretty decent gluten-free breads out now. They've come light years forward. From 20 years ago, they were all like sawdust because they're pure rice. But now they're pretty excellent with things like chia in them, flax in them, sorghum. I can't believe how much they're better. We've had buns recently. Denise is made out of almond flour and a few other components. And the other night we had focaccia bread made out of almond flour. So, yeah.
That sounds delicious.
It's not identical, but it's pretty good.
And then just kind of like a tidbit of information here, sourdough bread actually is not a probiotic food because you've cooked it. So if you've cooked it, you've killed the microbes, which means it's no longer probiotic.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And so ideally they're in raw things. You know, the same with sauerkraut. Denise always said, don't warm it up much because you're going to kill the bacteria.
Yeah.
I get that. And not only that, but when you look at labels, you want to purchase probiotic foods like sauerkraut and kimchi and so on that are still relatively live and available. Because sometimes, and they do this in yogurt a lot, they kill the bacteria to prolong the shelf life, but now you just lost 3/4 of the reason you were going to eat it in the first place.
Yeah, that's why I say specifically 24-hour yogurt. Sometimes you can find the length of fermentation written on the package if you're buying store-bought yogurt, but really your best bet is just to make it yourself.
So Chris had a good question. There's a lot of information, of course, on what we're talking about in my book. How do we know which path to start down? So the way to contact Christina, for example, is go to Taymount, Taymount, taymountcanada.com, and you can get the email, which is info@taymountcanada.com, or other choices to contact them. There might even be a phone number there, and you can set up, the consultation with Christina, which is probably a good place for many people to start. If you're really, a pretty complicated individual and you've got lots of other things going on, including some medications, then you may want to contact me, and you can contact me or the woman that helps set up my appointments at info@drbillcode.com. So DRBILLCODE, info@drbillcode.com. And then we can help you directly on that, because our goal is to empower you to get well. You have to do most of the journey. You are doing all the journey and often most of the work, but we're here to give you wisdom, suggest roads you might walk down in your journey to get better.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are at 5 o'clock.
We are, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think even though we're still on black or invisible here,
Yeah.
I'm hoping you can see us or at least hear us. And thanks very much for coming. Once again, share this, please, with contacts or friends. We'll be back again at 4 o'clock next week. Did we talk about our topic for next week?
We haven't really.
Well, why don't we talk about mitochondrial recovery? Because I know
Okay.
that's an important part in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Mitochondrial recovery or energy is tantamount to almost all healing. So we'll work on mitochondrial principles next week. So it'll be a bit on supplements, but it'll also be on foods and other ways that you can get better.
That sounds good to me.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, we'll see you next Tuesday.